Okay, this is our third installment of the Civil War, and this is a pretty quick one. Um, Remember, this test will be strictly over my notes. This is, I don't know if I told you guys this, but this test will not have anything from the other teachers. It's just mine. So I'd make sure I keep a hold of these notes that we're using because I will use them on my test. Today we're looking at some of the important people of the Civil War, and then we're going to take a look at African American soldiers in the Civil War. So let's get started. Important people for the Union side of the Civil War. Well, first is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is the 16th President of the United States. Abraham Lincoln was the Republican candidate. He won the Republican nomination. He's a really unique candidate because he had very little success in running other campaigns. He won the nomination against a gentleman by the name of William Seward, who the two of them did not get along at all, and yet Lincoln will still appoint him to be his Secretary of State. After winning the Republican nomination, he'll then be in a five-way battle for the presidency against two sides of the Democratic Party and one constitutional party. And he will be up against, I guess it's four sides then, four parties. The Republican, Democrat has two, and then the Constitutional Party. And he will win the election in a surprise kind of deal. When he's elected, again, he takes over for a mess. The South is finally had enough. Underneath James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States, who does virtually nothing and lets this crisis build and build and build. Lincoln inherits where six states have already seceded from the Union when he is finally sworn in, though he continually tries to reassure the South that he is not going to take away their slaves. The South feels through legislation and through publications and through speeches that the North doesn't respect the South and the Southern lifestyle, and they say, we have the right to just disengage and pull out of this union. And the Union and Lincoln go, no, you don't. And so Lincoln's whole concern is keeping the Union together, as I've said a number of times, the first year and a half, 2 years of the war. It isn't until the Battle of Antietam that it becomes the issue becomes about slavery. Lincoln is underneath extreme pressures from all sides. Not only is the South and Robert Lee an excellent tactician who makes it extremely difficult for him to win, he also has got the Northern politicians and the Northern people that are saying, what are we doing this for? They are not at all in favor of this war, and yet Lincoln will not end the war unless the South says no. They will come all the way back in, living by the Constitution of the United States, and they will give up the right to slavery. As the war goes on, he is saying that this is wrong. He does win a surprise election in 1864. It was widespread. Even himself said that he thought he was going to get beat. But in just before the election in September, General Grant, the lead general in the Union Army, will capture Atlanta and take all of Georgia, and that will boost morale in the Union, and they will then reelect President Lincoln. Lincoln will be killed 2 weeks after the Civil War is ended, and we'll talk about that more here in a little bit, but he'll be killed and will go down as, if not the best, in the top three of the greatest presidents we've ever had. The next gentleman underneath his command is a guy by the name of Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is the third or fourth general that Lincoln will put in charge of the Union Army. Grant has a pretty good success rate against the South. throughout the war, and he rises up through the ranks. And eventually, in 1864, he'll take control over the entire army. Grant will be the general that will be the representative of the Union against the Confederate General Lee in the surrender of the South. Very well respected. He'll become the 18th president of the United States, and he'll serve 2 terms. The next gentleman is a guy by the name of William Sherman, and Sherman's an interesting guy. Sherman is another general that had had a mixed bag of success. He had been given commands, and then they'd been taken away from him. He had actually pleaded early in the war Lincoln not to give him command of Union forces by himself because he didn't believe in himself. That would be a tough one if you were Lincoln, to say that you were going to have your general there that would be asking you not to be placing him in command of troops. So he, though, gets underneath General Grant, and General Grant is a calming influence to him. And the two of them work really, really well, and they really get things rocking and rolling at the end of 1863 and 1864. He'll take Vicksburg, which is an enormous victory for the North. It's the southern version of the Gettysburg. The Gettysburg is up north in Virginia, and Vicksburg is going to be down there in New Orleans in Mississippi area, right on the Mississippi River, I should say. And they're going to capture that, and that's going to be an enormous victory. And then after that, Sherman is going to be he's considered to be, Sherman is, as a major architect to modern warfare. And you say, well, how does a general that's commanding an army in 1865 be considered one of the founding forefathers of modern warfare? And what is total warfare? Well, Sherman was the one that understood that you had to take the fight. We couldn't just defeat the Confederate soldier and hope to win the war. He realized we had to take the war to the home front and to the people of the South. And so after taking Vicksburg and Atlanta, Sherman will go up north, Grant will go north to capture Lee, try to hunt him down. And Grant will tell Sherman, I want you to cause havoc. And Sherman will take 60,000 Union troops and go through all of Georgia and all the way down across the southern section into Florida, where he will burn, destroy vegetation, crops, livestock, make it where the South, destroy railroad lines, and he'll put the people of the South at odds and want to get out of the war. Not well liked by a lot of the people of the South. Now, he did not kill. He didn't just randomly kill women and children and elderly people in the South, civilians. But if he had to, they did it. But it was not something he had commanded his officers to do by any means. So there is a difference between him and, say, a terrorist. A terrorist does blow up schools. He wasn't blowing up schools. He would burn someone's farm and kill all the livestock or set all the livestock free so the South would not be able to feed their troops. And that's Mr. Sherman. Next, we go to the Confederate people of the Civil War, and we've only got a couple. Should have a bunch more, but our curriculum doesn't. Should be talking about a number of generals because they do such a good job. But the two people we're going to talk about is Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis will be elected by the Confederacy to be the president over the, 13 states, 12 states. He is a Mexican war hero, the war against Mexico that had been fought 30 years before, 25 years before. He was a senator in the state of Mississippi, and he will be pulled in to lead the Confederacy. Now, he'll also be the one that actually starts the Civil War when he fires on the Union troops in South Carolina at Fort Sumter. And he he's going to be the guy that does this. He doesn't have as much power as Lincoln does because the South will be divided and cut up by the Union forces, and the South doesn't see eye to eye with each other. The states don't agree on how to fight the war, and so they're a little bit like each into like we were in the Revolutionary War. You were fighting for your state, not for your country or your belief in the whole Union. Last but not least is the head general for the Confederate Army, a guy by the name of Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee is an excellent tactician, a great commander, general for the Confederate soldiers. Lee is up against very difficult odds. He's outnumbered in every category: money, troops, guns, rail lines, everything. The Union has vast superiority over Robert Lee, and yet Robert Lee waxes the Union forces, just pummels them the first 18 months to 2 years of the war. And from there on out, he's going to be fighting on a defensive war and losing terms, but he really inflicts a lot of damage on the Union forces. He will finally be forced to surrender to the Union forces in 1865 in Virginia at the Appomattox Courthouse, which we talked a little bit about beforehand. But it goes down in the history as being one of the greatest generals of the United States. Last but not least, let's take a look at the African Americans and what their role was in the war. Initially, when the war broke out, blacks were not allowed to serve in the Union forces, and this was done for two reasons. One was the Union forces and the Union soldiers did not want to serve alongside African Americans. There was discriminatory practices done throughout the North. They may have said we shouldn't own them people, but they didn't treat the African American citizen with equal status as a white citizen. And then the other reason is Lincoln said, we've got these 6 border states that chose to stay in the Union and not secede to the South. And if we say that blacks can serve in the Army, that's likely or possible they'll secede too. And he didn't want to see that happen. So, but finally in 1862, with the amount of carnage that you have in the war and the number of people that are dying, Lincoln accepts that blacks can serve, and it's a tribute. It's an amazing tribute to the African American community that in 1860 they made up about 1 to 2% of the overall population. But at the end of the war, the numbers that have been talked about is that they served up to as high as 10% of the entire Union forces was made up by African Americans. Again, African American population in the country was 1, maybe 2%, but they made up 10% of the overall Union forces. So a lot of them served. They were not allowed to serve with whites. They served in separate, segregated units. They were given usually really crappy details. They weren't paid as much, the same as white soldiers were, but they nonetheless, it made a big difference. They did do a lot of the maintenance jobs and that, or some of the lower skill level jobs, but it was something that by the end of the war, their impact was felt by the South, without question. The most famous regiment of the African American soldiers was the Massachusetts 54th. If you ever get a chance, take a look at the movie Glory. It's a great movie paying tribute to the Massachusetts 54th. And they had a battle where the Southern forces were in a place called Fort Wagner. And the 54th Massachusetts came to the rescue of a bunch of white Union soldiers. They went up against the fortified fort of Fort Wagner and just got cut to ribbon, just just destroyed. And that went down as a great tribute to the African American soldiers in that. The Confederates, on the other hand, treated if you were a black serviceman and you were caught, you were immediately shot. You were not put in a prisoner of war camp. You were treated terribly. You were whipped, hung, shot. They did not look upon these people with favorable outlook. So tribute to what they did and what they were a part of. So there we are, 15 minutes into that thing, and let's go to the movie.